Well, good morning. It's good to have you back with us for another Bible study on Whole50. We are now on day 17, and today the title is God is in Control, and we are here in Isaiah chapter 40. I was reading through it this morning, and I was wondering why in the heck I chose Isaiah for part of the Bible study. Isaiah is a tough book. It may be one of those books that, unless you've been forced to read it because of some odd Bible reading plan, you may have never found yourself there, or even in this area of the Old Testament, in the prophets, the minor prophets, the major prophets. It's a major prophet or a minor prophet because of the length of the book, not because the prophets were more or less important than each other. But I think what you're going to find today, as I found when reading this, is there is actually a lot of portions of Isaiah that we know and even quote that you may not have known come from Isaiah. So you're going to maybe find some familiar things in today's passage. But before we get there, I do want to remind you, if you've seen it, just basically released it yesterday. We are starting another Bible study. It's weird. We're only day 17 out of 50 days in this Bible study, but what are we going to do on day 51? Well, we're going to start a new Bible study called Party On. One of the things after the in-depth Whole50 that I thought would be fun is for us to just look at the celebrations in the Bible. Look at the places where people eat, where they feast, where they fellowship, where they have festivals. And I was surprised to learn that there are a lot of places. In fact, I had to cut a lot of them out. And so I feel like there could be a part 2 and a part 3 of this as you look at food and dining in the Bible. And it just kind of lit a fire underneath me and made me excited. And I hope that it will you as well. And I will send this to everybody who donates to Christ's Table anytime in the month of April. And so this is about to go to print, and we'll receive those back and send them out to you at the beginning of May, and you'll have them just in time for the start of the Bible study on May 17th. So anybody who donates online or through the mail to Christ's Table in the month of April will receive that, and it's going to be a lot of fun going through that. And in fact, we've got an extra special gift or two that we're going to throw in the package this time when we send them out to you. And so thank you for making this ministry possible through your generous donations, and also just by being a part, more importantly. So as we come to the book of Isaiah, I have a little bit of a different rhythm that I want to do this morning. I want to start, first of all, by posing a couple of questions that are posed by the book of Isaiah. And the first one is this: what will motivate the people of God to actually trust him and become the people that they're called to be? This is an important question because whenever we come to this part of the book of Isaiah, what's happened is God's children, the nation of Israel, have not really been acting like God's children. They have been acting out. And because of that, they have been sent into captivity, into exile, which essentially means that they have been removed from the promised land, from the land of Israel, and are exiled outside of the land of Israel somewhere else. Essentially, they had an agreement. The technical word for that is a covenant. But they had an agreement with God that said that God would hold up his end if they would hold up their end. God's end was he would allow them to remain in this promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that we've read about in Joshua when we talked about Caleb, and we talked about the Minority Report. And so God would allow them to remain in the land, would protect them there as long as they would hold up their end, and that was essentially to remain a one God people, to worship the one true God, Yahweh. And so they had failed to do that. And so God essentially removes them from the land. And so the question that Isaiah, the prophet, the voice of God, is posing is what is going to motivate the people of God to actually trust him, to become the people that they're called to be. Now, you may immediately recognize that this is a question that can apply to us as well. Whenever we walk away from God or have struggled believing in God or are living in exile, what motivates us? What would motivate us to actually trust God so that we can become the people whom we're called to be and the kind of people who God knows we can be? Many of us, even today, are living in exile. Maybe not because we've had a covenant with God, but we're living in exile because we've removed ourselves from God, or something that we've been involved in, or something that we've done, as removed ourselves from God. So that's question one. The other question is, how will it be possible for sinful Israel to become God's people again at all? What's to be done about the sin that's alienated them from God? And this actually is something that even yet today keeps so many of us from finding God again, from worshiping God again, from feeling as though we can be people of faith again, as feeling that we have done so much, that we've gone so far, that we've so severed the relationship between God and ourselves that we can't ever be those people again. We can't be that person again whom has a childlike faith, who trusts God, whom we feel like God can love because we've done so many things that are unlovable. We might think that God wants us, but maybe we don't, or maybe we're just not sure that we want God anymore, that we want that life anymore. And so when you're feeling alienated from God, what's to be done about all that water that's gone under the bridge? These are a couple of the questions that are being posed, not just even yet today, but are also being posed in the book of Isaiah when we get to chapter 40. God says to his prophet Isaiah, to the people who are living in exile, "Comfort my people." In fact, he says it twice. And whenever he says it twice, that's a big deal. Comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and tell her that her sad days are gone. Imagine living in exile. They lived in exile for a really long time. They had thought that God had forgotten about them. They believed that God probably would never allow them back into their land, that it would never be the same again. How could they endure this kind of severed relationship with God and yet still sometime in the future everything be okay? It seemed unreasonable to them, and maybe even it seemed impossible to them. God must still be angry with us. How could he not be angry with us? He was angry enough with us to discipline us and to remove us from the promised land. This can't be the end of his frustration or anger. Clearly, he still needs to teach us a lesson. And so God comes into the picture and says, you're probably expecting me to still be speaking words of frustration over the things that you've done. Maybe you imagine your parent, or maybe you as a parent, when your children are expecting more discipline, they're expecting you to still be frustrated. You walk into the room or you walk in their presence and you can feel their fear, their frustration, their sadness. They're expecting you to unload on them. And instead, you surprise them by offering words of kindness, words of love, a hug, physical touch. Wasn't what they were expecting, right? Instead of continuing to punish them, which let's assume in this moment they deserve still even more punishment, you give them words of comfort and you speak tenderly to them. The surprise, the shock on their face is the surprise and the shock that would be felt here by the people of Jerusalem. Tell her that her sad days are gone and her sins are pardoned. I've put all of that stuff behind me. Yes, the Lord has punished her twice over for all of her sins. Listen, can you hear it? It's the voice of someone. Clear the way through the wilderness for the Lord. Make a straight highway through the wasteland for our God. Fill in the valleys and level the mountains and the hills. Build a road. God is returning back to us. Nothing will stand in his way. Life may seem and be a wasteland right now, but let's level all those mountains and hills. You know, I hear this and I think about the own state of my heart, the own state of my soul. You know, I see this, you know, maybe literally, but I also see this metaphorically. You know, whenever you have been in exile from God, apart from him, you become a wilderness. You become a wasteland. It happens. And so clear a way through that wilderness inside of you. Make a straight highway through that wasteland of your life and your soul right now. All of those hills and valleys, those ups and those downs, those cavernous places of difficulty that have been a part of your journey apart from God. Let's level all of those things out. Let's iron all of those things out. Level the mountains and the hills. Fill in the valleys. Straighten the curves. Smooth out the rough places. That way you have a level sight line to see that the glory of God is going to be revealed, and everyone is going to be able to see it together. The Lord has spoken. In a sense, it will be the case. Nothing will stop this from happening. A voice said, "Shout." I asked, "What should I shout?" Shout that people are like the grass, that their beauty fades as quickly as the flowers in the field. The grass withers, and the flowers fade beneath the breath of the Lord. And so it is with people. The grass withers and the flowers fade, but the word of our God stands forever. If God says it, it will be. No matter when, no matter how, it will come to pass. And then verse 9. Verse 9 is actually a turning point. And if you have the Bible study, we ask a question in there about this verse. Why is this verse a turning point? O Zion, messenger of good news, shout from the mountaintop. Shout it louder, O Jerusalem. Shout and do not be afraid. Tell the towns of Judah that your God is coming. Yes, the sovereign Lord is coming in power. He will rule with a powerful arm. See, he brings his reward with him as he comes. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will carry the lambs in his arms, holding them close to his heart, and he will gently lead the mother sheep with their young. Now, this is just the first part of Isaiah chapter 40, and you really need to read the rest of Isaiah 40. This is just kind of an introduction, and I don't have enough time. In fact, I feel like every day I take way too much time on these. So I don't have enough time to go through each and every point and verse. But essentially, this chapter builds to a crescendo, and it actually keeps building through the next few chapters as God continues to speak comforting words to his people and powerful words to his people in the midst of their suffering. See, this is prophetic, which means that it's forward-looking. So God is telling them things that will happen. And so he is giving them hope. And hope is something that is desperately needed for those who are disconnected, especially those who are disconnected from God. Now, what I want to do, though, is I want to, before we go, give a few points and things to think about. So I want to draw up two verses from the part that I'm not reading, but you're going to read, right, in Isaiah 40, the rest of it. And then I want to give a couple of points that are going to help us all kind of understand the context here and what's going on and how to close the chapter, as it were. So the first one that I noticed is a few verses later in verse 22. God sits above the circle of the earth, and the people below him seem like grasshoppers to him. I laughed out loud when I read this, and I'm not sure that I actually would have noticed this verse had we not just a few days ago read the passage about giants being in the land and feeling like grasshoppers and talking about the power of grasshoppers. And I think it's interesting because they would have actually had that story. They would have had the record of that story. And so it is almost assured that they would have gotten in their minds the picture of the giants in the land that they longed for. Remember, they were called grasshoppers. The report came back from the majority and said, we can't take this land. God's promised us this land, but there are giants in the land, and we're like grasshoppers to these giants. There's no way we're going to be able to do this. And so eventually they did take the land. Those grasshoppers did. And so I think that, whenever God speaks this word back to him, it's a reminder, I sit above the circle of the earth, and the people below seem like grasshoppers to him. So, yeah, okay. We are grasshoppers, and yet God still loves us, and God still cares for us, and God still takes care of us. And back when we called ourselves grasshoppers, in comparison to the giants that were around us, the grasshopper still prevailed over the giants. And with God, who sits above the circle of the earth, this exile that we're in is nothing compared to God. And that's comforting to know that He can return us to the land that we on our own cannot, and that God can return you as well to what you've been missing, what's been taken from you, the relationships that have been severed. Even if you're a grasshopper, even if those things are giants in comparison to your ability with God, all things are possible. Now, the other verse that I want to throw out there is a verse that should be wildly familiar to you, even if you're not a person of faith, and that's the final verse of this chapter. But those who trust in the Lord will find new strength. They will soar high on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. It's one of the most famous verses in the Bible. Many sermons have been preached on this. Some of those have not taken into account the context in which it's written, and some of those sermons and books have taken into account the context in which it's written. But again, in the Bible study today, one of the things that I pose to you is, in reading Isaiah chapter 40 and then seeing this verse and where it is, does it change the meaning of it for you? Does the context in which it's written in give new light and new inspiration and new insight to what this verse might mean and why it was written? So there's two things that I want to say. So before we go, though, I want to give a few points that come to mind. I asked a few questions in the beginning, and so I want to give a few things that come to mind as we read through this chapter, and hopefully some things you'll walk away with, some things of your own each and every time we have a Bible study, and maybe you'll walk away and they're the same things that I walk away with, or maybe not. But here are the things that I think I walk away with. First of all, the people's problems suddenly shrink in the perspective of God's mighty power. And so what we know, as we've said, when we walk into Isaiah chapter 40, is we're walking into a group of people who are in a context of great problems. They have been removed from their homeland. They've spent generations away from it. They don't know when, or more rightly, if that's ever going to end. They feel as though they're being punished by God, and they are in some sense. And they don't feel as though that punishment is over. And yet God shows up back on the scene and doesn't seem intent on punishing them anymore, but speaking words of love and comfort to them. And the way He speaks loving comfort to them in Isaiah 40 is by expressing His great power. And in the presence of God's great and mighty power, the people's problems shrink. And I think that that's a huge, important word to us, especially those of us who are having problems, who are struggling or suffering, whether it be in our relationship with God, with others, with whatever it may be, is that in the presence of God's great and mighty power, and we see that in Isaiah 40, other places in Scripture as well. Job is another classic place where we see God's mighty power on display. People's problems shrink. Literally, figuratively, metaphorically. In the presence of God's mighty power, our problems don't seem as problematic anymore. In the presence of God's mighty power, our problems don't seem as powerful anymore. In the presence of God's mighty power, our problems pale in comparison, especially when compared to a God that has the power to do anything, to change anything. It's one of the messages of Isaiah 40, and certainly one of the messages that was intended to be communicated to God's people in a moment when they'd lost faith in God. God essentially shows up on the scene and he says this to them: I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. And so whenever we read Isaiah 40, that is one of the things that I walk away with, and maybe that you should walk away with as well, is that God essentially states in Isaiah 40, I'm God, and there is no other God. There's no other thing that should be given as much power in your life as I am. You gave other things more power and worshiped other things, and because of that, you reaped a reward for it. And we do when we do that as well. But God says, I'm God, and the lessons of your life should teach you, if the words of the Bible don't, that there is no other. And because I'm God, there's none other like me. The second thing, and finally, is God essentially shows up on the scene and says, don't fear. Don't be afraid. I'm with you. Don't be dismayed. Don't be discouraged, for I am your God. God says, why are you so downcast? Why are you so fearful? I'm with you. I have always been here with you. Even when you couldn't see me, even when you couldn't feel me, even when I was frustrated and angry with you, even when you were frustrated and angry with me. I was always here. Even if you didn't know it, I was always here. So don't be dismayed. I am your God. And he's saying the same thing to you as well. Well, I hope you enjoy Isaiah chapter 40. I'm looking forward to hearing any feedback or comments that you have. You can post them on YouTube, on Facebook, in the chat feed, on Twitch, whenever you finish reading it today. Looking forward to being with you tomorrow as well. Don't forget, to everyone who donates in the month of April to Christ's Table, we're going to send you the next Bible study. Party on. It's going to be a celebration. Go to christtable.today. And until tomorrow, happy reading.